A wonderful welcome, and what a privilege and pleasure to be here in Canada and meeting with all the brothers and sisters from the Iranian Canadian community from all across Canada. I'm really touched, and I'm particularly touched that my great friend Stevenson As you've heard, I've spent 15 years of my life in the European Parliament. I retired 2 years ago. And at the very start of my career in the European Parliament, I used to get ambassadors to Brussels asking if they could come to my office for meetings. And inevitably, the ambassador from Iran asked if he could come to my office. And I met him, and he told me about the wonderful things that the Islamic Republic had achieved since the revolution. And then he asked for a second meeting a month later. And in the meantime, I read a horrific report about how the Iranian regime had hanged a 14-year-old girl. She'd been raped by an IRGC officer. He was reprimanded. She was taken to the court accused of adultery, and the judge sentenced her to death, age 14. She tore off her veil in astonishment at this cruel sentence. And the judge said, because you have defiled my court by taking your veil off, I will take you outside and hang you myself. And when I read that, my blood turned cold. And I said to my staff, tell the ambassador to come. He came to my office and he started to tell me about the great things the regime was achieving. And I said, Ambassador, stop right there. Your regime hanged a 14-year-old girl 2 weeks ago. Never come into this office again. Never cross the threshold of my office again. I said, I can tell you now that I will devote the rest of my political career and the rest of my life to ensure we bring down your evil regime. Now, I've frequently been stopped in the corridors of the European Parliament by representatives of the MEP, the PMOI, asking if I would sign petitions and the usual things that they do. And I asked my assistant, I said, contact the MEP, tell them I want to speak to them. I got a phone call, and I said, I flew the Iranian ambassador out of my office this morning, what can I do to help you? And I tell you that phone call changed my life because they've never let me off the hook since. While we're reminiscing, I remember another occasion when the foreign minister from Iran, Manouchehr Mottaki, do you remember him? He had been kicked out of Turkey, where he was the Iranian ambassador, because they stopped an official diplomatic car from his embassy in Ankara trying to cross the border from Turkey back into Iran. And the border guards, the Turkish border guards, could hear banging in the trunk. And they said, hang on, stop, open the trunk. And there was a prisoner tied up, gagged, hand and foot, in the trunk of this car. And when they took his gag off and untied him, He said, I'm from the MEK, I'm from the PMOI. They are capturing us on the streets of cities and towns in Istanbul and Ankara, and we are held in a dungeon underneath the Iranian embassy in Ankara and tortured. And then they take us back in the trunk of the car to Iran to be executed. So Mataki immediately was kicked out as the ambassador, sent back to Iran, and what do the mullahs do? They make him foreign minister. And then some stupid people in our parliament decided it would be a good idea to invite Mataki to come and speak to the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament. So I got some of my colleagues together and I said, okay, let's arrange a little welcome for this foreign minister. And we stood outside the meeting room the day he was coming. I had a picture of the girl that had been killed in the uprising. Do you remember Neda? We had several pictures of Neda lying dead in the street. And when Mataki came along the corridor with all his entourage and bodyguards and half a dozen film crews and journalists from Iran working for the state, we stepped in front of him and I went up to him and held up the picture of Neda and I said, you are not welcome in this parliament, you are a murderer. You know, his bodyguards grabbed me, and I said, how dare you come into this house and start manhandling elected members of this house? This is not Tehran. Get your thugs out of here. Seriously, why do we always in the West seem to get it wrong in our dealings with the Iranian regime? Why is it that in Britain, where I come from, the foreign policy seems to get it wrong? The State Department in America seems to get it wrong. We always seem to get it wrong. I have to say, only in Canada, where you got it right, where you severed relations with Iran, where you pulled out of the country altogether, where even in June 2013, you had a unanimous resolution condemning the horrific atrocity that I'll speak about more this evening. Your parliament did that before the release of the audio tape, which we only heard. Montaseri's son released the audio tape only in August this year, but in 2013, your parliament unanimously approved a resolution condemning the massacre of political prisoners. So Canada very often gets it right, but the rest of the West, even the United Nations, seem to get it wrong. You know, I recall when Ayad Alawi won the election as Prime Minister of Iraq, and the Iranian regime said, we have a red line against Alawi. He might be a Shia, but he is a secularist. He wants a government of national unity in Iraq. We're not prepared to accept that. And they persuaded the West, we've got to have Nouri al-Maliki as the Iraqi Prime Minister. And then they twisted the arms of some of the pro-Iranian factions inside the Majlis in Baghdad, the Hakim Party. Although it's an Iraqi party, its headquarter office is in Tehran. And Muqtada al-Sadra, whose people had murdered many Americans. They were persuaded to join a coalition to ensure that even although he lost the election, Maliki became the Prime Minister. Iraq. And of course he was a puppet of the Iranian regime. They pulled his strings and they said to him, get rid of all the Sunnis in your cabinet. So first of all, he tried to arrest the vice president of Iraq, Tariq al-Hashimi, a guy who had written the constitution of Iraq, a humanitarian, a great humanitarian. He arrested his 12 bodyguards. One of them was so severely tortured, he died under torture. Amnesty International reported that his parents couldn't even recognize his body when it was returned to him. And based on that confession, the vice president of Iraq was sentenced to death in absentia. He fled, first of all, to Kurdistan. Now he's in Turkey. Then he tried to arrest his Sunni finance minister because Tehran was telling him, get rid of the Sunnis, kill them. The finance minister's brother was shot down in front of his family. And it started an uprising of the Sunnis in Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, Al-Anbar province. They said, you know, this is horrific. How can we be treated like this by our own government? At the instigation of the Iranian regime. And that civil war that started, where the response by Maliki to the uprising of his Sunnis, we will become an ally of the West in helping to fight ISIS and to drive them out of Iraq. And they exploit this situation to carry out their own genocidal campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Sunni population of neighboring Iraq. We've seen what happened in Fallujah and Ramadi. Both of these ancient cities are now smoking heaps of rubble, and tens of thousands of the male population have simply disappeared. Because of the so-called liberation of these cities by the Shia militias. It's not the Iraqi military. They were so broken by corruption, they have virtually disappeared. There are over 100 Shia militias now, financed by Tehran, commanded by General Qasem Soleimani, a listed terrorist, head of the Quds Force, from the IRGC. The Quds Force, the IRGC, Soleimani, all listed terrorists internationally. Soleimani is in Iran, in Iraq, proudly saying, I am leading the liberation of these cities. And he ordered his Shia militias to investigate, interrogate every male above the age of 14 who came out of Fallujah and Ramadi in case any of them were jihadists, in case any of them were ISIS. And many of them were tortured and many of them disappeared, and only now they're discovering the mass graves where they have been buried. And now the same people are encircling Mosul, where over 1.5 million Sunnis live, the second largest city in Iraq. Which is why Erdogan from Turkey has sent Turkish troops in saying, we don't stand seeing any more massacres of our Sunni brothers and sisters. We are coming here with our Turkish troops to protect them. And Muqtada al-Sadr and some of the Shia militias are saying, if you come to Mosul, we will fight against you. Even American military advisors, who everybody is. And this is a shambolic situation which is going to end with great bloodshed. We in the West, we're providing air cover, airstrikes. We think Iran must be on our side because they're helping to liberate these cities from ISIS. Iran is getting rid of all the Sunnis they can in order that they can extend their evil regime across great tracts of neighboring Iraq. That's always been their objective. They were the ones that persuaded Maliki to open a road directly to Syria so that they could send tens of thousands of troops and money, pumping it into holding up, propping up the horrific, bloody regime of Bashar al-Assad. That in turn attracted Vladimir Putin and the Russians to come in. And now, every day in the news, you see the results of Iranian meddling in Syria, with aid convoys being bombed, with hospitals being bombed by the Russians and by the Iranians. There are 70,000 troops from Iran now fighting on the front line to prop up Bashar al-Assad in Syria. 70,000. Tens of thousands of them are Afghanis, refugees who fled from Afghanistan to Iran, and they had no livelihood, they had no income, and the mullahs have said, if you go and fight in Syria, if you're killed, we will make your families, we will give them full Iranian citizenship and a pension. And thousands of them are being killed as cannon fodder in Syria. We know the mullah regime is now propping up not only Bashar al-Assad, but they're backing the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And last week, it was Iranian missiles that were being fired by the Houthi rebels at American destroyers in the Gulf of Aden. So they are always fighting a proxy war against America. And yet, behind all of this, where the regime is backing Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi rebels, the Shia militia in Iraq, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, despite all of this, Obama decided it would be a great idea, a great legacy from his 8 years as president, to have a nuclear deal. He left John Kerry in Vienna for 6 weeks. When that Secretary of State, his attention was required in crises around the world, but he was ordered to stay in Vienna for 6 weeks until they got a signature on the nuclear deal. A deal which released $150 billion in frozen assets as a windfall for the Iranian regime, which was teetering on the brink of economic bankruptcy. And the people of Iran are protesting every day on the streets. Teachers are not paid. Bread riots because the price of bread is escalating almost every week. The people who are protesting thought, well, maybe some of this money will come to help us. Has it? Not a penny. That money has gone into exporting terror, which is what Iran specializes in. That money has gone into Syria, it's gone into Yemen, it's gone into Iraq. None of it has been to the benefit of the beleaguered Iranian people. And yet this is the nation we think now, after they've signed the nuclear agreement, that we can do business with. A nation which, now we know from the tape released in August this year by the son of Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, I think a courageous move by the son of Ayatollah Montazeri. We hear from this tape his father almost shouting in frustration at the three-man death committee appointed by Ayatollah Khomeini and instructed to implement his fatwa against the Mujahideen, against the MEK. His fatwa, which he had introduced in July of 1988, where he said any member of the MEK who remains steadfast in their support for that organization must be executed. And he ordered that the execution should be done as quickly as possible. And you can hear Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, who was the nominated successor to Khomeini. He was second in line in the whole Islamic Republic. You can hear him shouting at the three-man death committee, how can you do this? How can you take people who have been sentenced in our courts because of their support support for the MEK. They'd been sentenced to 1 year, 2 years, 5 years in prison. And you bring them from their cell and take them before a Sharia judge, and they're asked a single question: are you remaining steadfast in your support for the munafiqin, which they called them, the hypocrites? And if they even mention the word mujahideen, they are taken out into the courtyard of the prison and hanged from a crane. The cranes were operating in batches of 10. 10 people were being hanged every 15 minutes, from 8 in the morning till 6 in the evening, every day for months. And Montasiri is shouting in anger: you're hanging pregnant women, you're hanging teenagers. You will go down in the annals of history of our country as criminals. You're undermining the credibility of the whole revolution. How can you do this? And then you hear the leader of the Three-Man Death Commission protesting that this is a fatwa. We are carrying out the will of God. Who is this guy that we hear so clearly on the tape? His name is Mustafa Pur Mohammadi. He is now the Justice Minister in Iran. The guy who supervised the Holocaust, the annihilation of 30,000 political prisoners. The biggest atrocity surely since the end of the Second World War is the Justice Minister in Iran. And we think in the West that we can sell Boeing aircraft, Airbus, that we can buy oil from this regime without mentioning human rights. How is this possible? Now, I have spent the last 2 or 3 days speaking to ambassadors at the United Nations in New York and saying to them, the Iran resolution, the single country Iran resolution, which will be debated in November this year and is circulating around all the members of the United Nations right now. The sponsor of that resolution is Canada. And I've been saying to all of these ambassadors who I've met from Europe, from the Middle East, you have got to mention this atrocity in this year's resolution. Not to do so would simply allow the mullahs to think that they can literally get away with murder. They have to be held to account. They have to be confronted, because Mustafa Pur Mohammadi, now that it's become a national scandal in Iran, now that it's been in the international news across the world, he has proudly come forward and said, okay, I did it. I'm proud I did the work of God. So he has admitted his guilt. The 3 men from the Death Commission are all in senior positions in the administration in Iran today. And the MEK held a press conference 2 weeks ago in France and released the names of hundreds of other members of the tribunals set up across the whole of Iran to implement the death penalty and to execute the 30,000 MEK supporters. So we know their names. They're still active in the regime. They're in senior positions. These people have to be indicted and brought before the international courts and charged with crimes against humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to say to you that, I wrote this book, Self-Sacrifice, Life with the Iranian Mujahideen, because in the 15 years and more that I've associated with the regime, we've gone through tough times. One of our brothers in Sacramento said to me the other day, if we are told in the MEK that we have to move a mountain, they take away the bulldozer and give us a teaspoon to do it, but we still succeed. When when I began working with the MEK, we were on the terrorist list in Europe, in my country, in the UK, in America. We were listed as terrorists. I remember getting a phone call in my office. My assistant said to me, there's a Mrs. I think it was a Mrs. Smith from, no offense, from the Foreign Office who wishes to speak to you. So I said, put her through. She said, I understand you're intending to go to Berlin this weekend to address a rally of the People's Mujahideen of Iran. We would strongly advise you from the British government that you should not do this. These people are terrorists. And I said, I'm sorry. First of all, I really don't like a civil servant from the Foreign Office phoning me as an elected member of Parliament and telling me what to do. But secondly, these people are not terrorists. This is trumped up propaganda nonsense dreamed up in Tehran that you have fallen for as part of the ludicrous appeasement policy that you seem determined to follow. And I said, I am fighting on behalf of these people and by their side to remove them from the terrorist list. She said, you will never succeed in doing that, but you've been warned you should not go to Berlin. After I hung up, I thought, this is kind of strange. And I said to my assistant, phone the Foreign Office in London and ask to speak to Mrs. Smith. Of course, the Foreign Office said, we have no Mrs. Smith working here. Weeks later, when we got the judges in one of the highest courts in London ordered the government to release the so-called classified evidence on which the terrorist charge had been based, and it was a huge volume of evidence. Lo and behold, in the middle of it was a 5-page transcript of my telephone conversation with Mrs. Smith, and she wasn't from the Foreign Office. She was from MI5, the intelligence agency. They had phoned me up as an elected member of the European Parliament from Britain, pretending that they were from the Foreign Office and trying to order me not to go to this rally with the MEK. These were the kind of things that we were confronting. But we won. It cost us millions in time, in effort, in money, in complex court cases across America and Europe. We won. We got the MEK removed from all the terror lists. Then we had the extraordinary problem of Camp Ashraf. After the Americans withdrew after the American military withdrew from Iraq, and we signed a deal with the Iraqi government that they would look after, they would protect, they would guarantee the safety of the 3,500 MEK refugees in Camp Ashraf. In fact, they remained under constant siege for 8 years from that moment on. They suffered 3 massacres where battalions of troops dressed in full military uniform, carrying submachine guns with armoured vehicles, running down women and unarmed civilians in the camp. Machine gunning. On one occasion, the wounded who'd been carried by their comrades into the hospital in Camp Ashraf, the Iraqis came in and shot them where they lay on the operating tables. The most brutal massacres. And when I went to Baghdad following a week after one of these massacres and insisted, when I met the foreign minister, insisted on being allowed to go to Ashraf. And he said, absolutely not. And I said, why not? he said, well, we have nothing to do with this. We don't know what happened. I said, listen, we have filmed evidence taken by some of the survivors. I can see the uniforms, our Iraqi military uniforms, although some of the soldiers could be held hard speaking Farsi, which speaks for itself. Obviously, again, the whole operation commanded and figured out in Tehran. So, you know, I said, if you have nothing to hide, why can't I go to Camp Ashraf? And the foreign minister said, because it's far too risky for you to go there now. And I said, there are 3,000 survivors waiting to see me. If you do not allow me to go, I will call a press conference on the steps of your ministry in Baghdad, now, right now, and tell them that you are guilty, that your government ordered that massacre, that you have blood in your hands, and that you are traitors. You said you would protect these people, you've done exactly the opposite. And I did call that press conference. Nouri al-Maliki himself twice then held press conferences to denounce me as a liar and an enemy of Iraq. And then, would you believe, 2 years ago, I got a phone call in my office in Brussels from an Iraqi living in Frankfurt, in Germany. He said, I've got a message from a very senior member of the Iraqi government, and I wonder if I could come to see you in your office. And I said, okay. We set up a meeting, and he came to Brussels. And he said that Nouri al-Maliki is a personal friend of mine, and he has sent me to speak to you. He has asked me what it will take for you to stop attacking. And I said, I'll tell you what it will take. It will take his appearance in the International Court in The Hague, indicted for crimes against humanity. You know, we saw the siege that took place, the psychological torture that was inflicted on the people in Camp Ashraf. The move then to Camp Liberty, which again were taken from the city of Ashraf, which they had built with their own hands, and compressed into a tiny half-square-acre concentration camp, where again they were subject to rocket attacks. You know, during the last 8 years, 177 of them were killed. They were under a medical siege where people with injuries, people with illnesses were not permitted to go to hospital, were not allowed to access proper medical care. This was the Iraqi government's response, always doing the bidding of Tehran, always doing what the mullahs were ordering them to do. There were 3 missile attacks on Camp Liberty, where they were sitting ducks. They weren't allowed to have any, even hard hats or protective vests, or even spades to dig trenches that they could hide in. They were sitting ducks. And you know, a week before the final bunch left for the airport to fly to Albania, the Iraqi military stopped a huge articulated truck within half a mile of the camp, carrying 80 missiles, trying to make its way to the camp. The mullahs had heard that the final refugees from the MEK were about to be taken to Albania, and they were trying to organize a final massacre a week before they left. So, you know, to hear that we have rescued all of these people, that they're safe now, really brought joy to my heart. And I've been to Albania a couple of years ago, after the first batch arrived, about a year and a half ago. I'm going to go back later this year to see all of them. But I remember myself and Aleko Vidal Quadras, we were meeting with the Prime Minister in Albania, said to us, you know, Iran never used to even have an embassy here in Tehran. They only had a consulate with a fairly junior diplomat. Now, he said, since the MEK started to arrive from Camp Liberty, they've opened an embassy, and suddenly, not only do they have an ambassador, they suddenly have discovered a great interest in Albanian culture because they've appointed 20 cultural attaches. All of them IRGC spies, for sure. So our brothers and sisters have security issues over there, I can assure you, but they're safe. They're out of Iraq, they're out of the direct line of fire of the mullahs. Now, people told me in all of these years, you will never get the MEK off the terrorists. You will never get any country to accept the people from Ashraf and Liberty. Well, it's because of all of you and all the Iranian community, expat community, the 100,000 people who come to Paris every year. It's because of your support for Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, the most formidable leader of the biggest and most organized opposition to the mullahs that exist. An opposition that wants to restore freedom, democracy, human rights, women's rights, an end to the death penalty, an end to torture, an end to these horrific massacres and summary executions, an end to the nuclear conspiracy. An organization that has a manifesto I would be proud to stand under as a politician. And the supporters worldwide, thousands and thousands of you, every meeting you attend, every letter you write, every petition you sign, every dollar you donate, you are the ones that have saved the MEK from Camp Liberty. You are the ones that got them off the blacklist. You are the ones that will restore freedom and democracy to Iran. And that's why I love you all and will continue to.
Struan, thank you so much for your passionate speech. Now, if you permit me, I want to ask Senator David Smith, our good friend, to say a few words, and after that, we would open the floor for Q&A questions and answers that we are more than happy to have questions that you might have, and Struan can, I hope, answer all questions. Thank you.